Today we have Keith Bailey joining us, who's an Interpretive Ranger of the Etowah Indian Mounds State Historic Site. Keith was born in Calhoun, Georgia, and as a kid spent a lot of time outdoors with family and with scouting. After graduating high school, he went to Reinhardt to get his associates in fine arts. Uh, he spent his time pursuing his interest in nature, history, tinkering, and he's had a lot of hobbies, including blacksmithing and genealogy. This, coupled with his years working in a dye house, uh, he began to care for his grandmother's farm, was self-employed, and homeschooled his oldest child. He spent several years volunteering at Red Top Mountain and occasionally a few other state parks as a friend of the Georgia State Parks, and volunteers with the Scouts as an adult leader. Returning to school after the economic crunch, he graduated magna cum laude from Georgia State University with a BA in anthropology. And I always love another anthropologist being around. So that's always a win for me. So if everyone can welcome Keith, then I want to turn it over to him. Keith, I think you might be muted real quick.
Yep, I was muted. Again, hello, everybody. Happy Archaeology Month. I'm going to be giving a talk here, and before I get started, what is archaeology? It's about finding artifacts and describing something. So I'm going to share a PowerPoint here, if I can find it. Share my screen. We want to go to the PowerPoint. And I'm going to all right, hopefully everybody can see this. So what is archaeology? A lot of people get it confused. We even sometimes have people try to say we're architects, but we study very old stuff, and there's different ways of looking at it. Some people think that we just look at the artifacts itself, the material remains, the arrow points, the pottery, the jewelry, the things that we find, and based on humans. And then other people look at it from a more anthropological look of that we're studying people and culture based on the analysis of the artifacts that we find. And there's not a lot of difference there, but it does make a little bit of a difference when you think about whether it's an art or science. And so I like to say it's both. From the scientific perspective, we're asking those kind of questions like how deep, how big, how much of something there is, how many baskets of dirt did it take to make the mound? And when you answer those questions, you just create more questions. So archaeologists, a lot of times they are digging, they're finding those artifacts, and they're quantifying them. They're measuring the piece of rock, the piece of pottery, they're weighing it, they're doing all those kind of things that you can do to basically anybody could repeat it. That piece of rock or that piece of pottery is always going to be the same. It's always going to weigh the same. It's always going to have the same shape, same color, unless something naturally is, of course, causing it to change. And then as an art, what did you find? That piece of stone obviously is rock, but is it an arrow point, a spear point, a knife? And that's where the interpretation comes in. Sometimes there's a story behind it that the science itself, telling you that it's a stone that weighs so many grams is not going to necessarily answer the question of what it was. You can do analysis on it and, determine maybe what it cut, and that would help you interpret what it is. So basically, what does it tell you and how is it used? But what archaeology is, it's basically being a detective and trying to describe what people did in the past. And archaeologists like to borrow the expertise of other people. So historians, geologists, biologists, chemists, physicists, astronomers, if they can input something that is useful to help archaeologists understand an artifact, that will in turn help them understand people and society, they're going to use that. So there again, they're looking at the material culture of all those things that we use and the resources they come from. So a wooden spoon is just a wooden spoon, but what kind of wood is it made of? Is it a local wood, or is it wood from some far off distant location? And how did it get here? And so that's partly what I'm going to talk about today, in that there's a lot of trade going on. So I have some points that I'm going to try to bring up, some sites. And hopefully this will work. Someone tell me if this doesn't come up, because I'm not seeing it.
Yeah, you might want to hit Control as you click it and try that. Otherwise, I don't know if it's going to work.
Yeah, I tried that. Let's see.
Nope, not that time either.
Okay, so what we've got here is anybody that wants to look at some of the types of Mississippian artifacts, you may want to jot down these links. And basically what you're going to do is UGA has this wonderful website that I often use when people come in and they've got a plate or a bowl and I want to show them what they found. You can look at all the different artifacts and that they have in ceramic types. So here at Etowah, if you were to come in and look, there's lots of different incised and stamped pottery. And these are the type of material culture that's going to let you know basically the time period and the culture that you're looking at. Certain cultures, like if you were to go over into Alabama to Moundsville, is still Mississippian culture, but their pottery is very different than what we see over here. There's some overlay, but they have a lot of pottery that's anamorphic, has animal shapes. We have some of that, but not necessarily as much as they do. Peach State Archaeology also has a lot of stuff on their website. And down at the projectile points net, they're going to have all these different points broken down into the different types and styles and time periods that we would see. So if you found a point out in your yard when you're digging in the flower garden and you wanted to know what it is, you could bring it to me. I'm not an expert. I'm going to rely on the projectile points. Yes, I can, look at it, but I'm not going to necessarily know the exact type of stone. Sometimes I would refer people to go to Tellus if they're wanting to know, the type of chert or type of quartz that it's made of. But all these things allow us to look back through time. So we have oral traditions, written history, archaeological data, and then there's all kinds of other scientific methods that we can use. As far as oral tradition, it's like playing the old game of telephone. You lose some information as time goes by, people's names, maybe the name of a site, maybe a certain device or tool was used in a story, and that slowly goes away. A good example for our area is the oral tradition of how in the 1750s, the Cherokee and the Creek were at war with each other, and they played a stickball game to decide who the winner was. Some people may remember some of the names of the players. Some people may not. They may know the name of the town. They may not. Oral tradition says it was played in ball ground. Sometimes these oral traditions eventually get written down in different ways. And so I always remind people that history is written by the victor. Sometimes things are left out on purpose. Sometimes things are added in on purpose, and they may or may not be exactly true. A good example is the story that I was told when I was young about how World War I was started with the sinking of the Lusitania and how it had no weapons on it. And then, of course, it was eventually found and had weapons on it. So archaeological data would be just that, where someone found that ship and they went down there and found something. So sometimes though you may neglect something. So here there's an oral tradition. I saw it written down once, can't find where it was, but some archaeologists were digging here way back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and supposedly they found some horse skeletons. The Native Americans were known to not have horses in this area back in the day when the mounds were found, and so those skeletal remains were thrown away. And unfortunately, the data showed that they were, found in remains of pottery that would have dated to that same time. So there are other archaeological scientific methods on how to date things. We often use carbon dating and other things, and I'll mention that here in a moment. But it helps us go back in a timeline. So I'm kind of going to go back from the present backwards, and I'm going to do it in a couple of different ways, and hopefully that I won't run out of time. But we're in the historic time period, and most people think of the historic time period for this area of North America as beginning with the end of the Mississippian period when Hernando de Soto comes through in 1540. Some people think that the Mississippian era actually lasted into about 1710 when the Natchez tribe, one of the last tribes practicing the Mississippian culture in this area, faded away. Of course, before that, we have the woodland period, which would have included the leek mounds that, of course, aren't here anymore, but 2 miles away from Etowah. And we have the archaic period before that, that goes all the way back to basically 8,000 years ago. And then before that, we've got the paleo period. So that's when people would have been hunting the large mastodons and mammoths and stuff, megafauna that you can see some of those remains in Tellus. So we can use geological dating, we can use ceramic dating, carbon-14 dating, we can use things, and there's a plethora of other ways to date things. Geological dating is one of the old methods that just have used, and that's basically the idea that dirt, when it's deposited, the oldest is going to be on the bottom. In archaeology, the oldest of something you're going to find is going to be on the bottom. That sometimes can be incorrect, especially if you have things like groundhogs and squirrels digging holes, removing stuff to the surface, things falling down the hole getting filled back up. Maybe there's an earthquake, a landslide, all these different things. And that's where geologists become the experts that archaeologists borrow from. Ceramic dating, basically we look at pieces of ceramic pottery, and knowing the dates and uses of those in context of other things in the soil, we're able to look at other sites with similar pottery and basically date one site based on what we know from the other. And that often comes from things like carbon-14 dating, which is where you take samples of carbon-bearing items, basically leaves and charcoal, things that you can look for carbon-14. So carbon itself has a half-life, or carbon-14 does, and when you measure that, you can come up with basically when the mid-range of something is. And they're usually in the science, there's a leeway of plus or minus years that you'll see. Tree ring dating, dendrochronology, is also interesting, because if you have trees, and this is usually best done in dry areas, that you can look at tree rings. It's almost like a barcode. You can look at other trees that you find, other wooden objects that you find, and use that to date them if you know when the tree existed that you're looking at. So basically you have to have lots of different trees with lots of different tree rings, and you compare them in the same territory or geological area. And that's some of the ways archaeologists can date things. And then, of course, going back in time, we have historians, people that actually write things. So here I've got a picture of Sequoyah, also known as George Gist, and Elias Boudinot, who run the Cherokee Phoenix. So without Sequoyah creating the Cherokee syllabary, Elias Boudinot could not have had a newspaper that was written in both English and Cherokee. Now, interestingly, Sequoyah, known as George Guest, and Elias Boudinot, both are named after other people that lived before them. George Gist was an explorer, trader, and he knew George Washington. Elias Boudinot was actually not the Cherokee Boudinot, but the previous one was actually the president of the Continental Congress back in the early days. And so we see that people write things. So if you want to see what was written in Cherokee Phoenix, you can look those up online. Next guy we have here that I want to talk about is Elias Cornelius. Him and his father both have their memoirs online. They're kind of interesting to read. Elias Cornelius actually visited what we would think of as Etowah. At the time, it was referred to as the town of Hightower along the Hightower River. The Etowah River used to be known as the Hightower, and there was a trail that ran along the river that was called the Hightower Mission Trail. And so Elias Cornelius had been sent down by the Baptist congregations to try to convince the Cherokee and the Creek to build missionary schools. And while he was in this area up at the town of Etowah, Hightower, which was upstream from where we are today, it actually was closer to where Highway 293 crosses the river. The Cherokee delegation or guides that he had showing him through the area took him to the mounds here, and him being a mathematician also as his other occupation, cut a grapevine estimated 16 feet and done some measurements, come up with the idea that the mounds were about 85 feet tall, and he took that grapevine with him and done the conversions after he went back. Some other contemporary writings, contemporary writings become historical documents. And so one of those people that we have is Benjamin Hawkins. Benjamin Hawkins was a Revolutionary War veteran. He was a senator, and eventually George Washington put him in charge of the title. His title was Indian Agent to the Southeast, and he came down and he actually talked to a lady in 1798 named Sally Hughes, trying to convince her to have her husband and other men in the area grow more cotton. And I believe Chief Van's sister was also there. And so it was a pretty big gathering. And we know where Sally Hughes's area was, her house, from old documents. And it sat there close to where Highway 293 crosses. And of course, in 1795, we also know that Benjamin Hawkins tried to sign a treaty with the Creek and Cherokee at the town of Hightower, which at that time seems to have been probably closer to Rome. There's actually some written documentation that says that there was a battle that occurred because some people from Tennessee didn't like the fact that he was trying to sign a peace treaty. And then, of course, Benjamin Hawkins is also known for signing the Hopewell Treaty, which kind of helped set some boundaries after the American Revolution between the Cherokee and the Creek and the new country of the United States. So before that, we also have the explorer William Bartram. If any of y'all have ever walked the Bartram Trail, you may know a little bit about him. He was actually a naturalist, so you can almost think of him as one of us park rangers running around in the state of Georgia looking at plants. He was a botanist, so he was looking at all the different plants in the area and making mention of it. And he also mentioned a lot about the Native Americans. So if you have a chance to read his book, that is actually a pretty good read. And before him, we see that the Cherokees in 1730 were asked to get a delegation together to go to England and Moytoy the Great, the chief of the Cherokee, asked a fellow by the name of Atakulakula to go. So you can see by the picture here, the depiction of them. They already have rifles and guns, and they're kind of dressed like English. There is anecdotal evidence that suggests that to help make them look more civilized at this time, they were actually dressed up like people from India, including turbans. And it would have been at this time possibly that the Cherokee and the Creek and the Seminole and some other Native Americans here in the Southeast started wearing those turbans that we see. Prior to that, we don't know a whole lot about what happened. We do know that in about 1566, 67, Juan Pardo came to this area of Georgia and done some exploring. And he came because Hernando de Soto was here before and had left people in this area. And most people don't realize that several people from Hernando de Soto's expedition had left. In this area. They basically stayed. One of those people was the gentleman of Salamanca, and he stayed at a town called Eulabahali. Some archaeologists think that was probably over at the town of Rome. I think my personal opinion is it was probably over at Uharli. Uharli, that area used to have some mounds, and going up Uharli Creek, there was quite a few different sites. So now I'm going to go back to talk a little bit archaeology for a second. There's a thing called tradition. And when we think of tradition, we're thinking about Christmas, holiday, things that we do on an annual basis that our mothers and fathers done, that their grandparents done, things that are handed down. Archaeologically speaking, when we talk about tradition, what we're talking about is how things were built, how things were created, so that when we look at a piece of pottery, we're talking about the tradition of how that functionally was built. So a piece of, say, a spearhead or an arrow point, they're going to have similarities to stuff that came before them because they were basically taught from one person to the other. So we can infer certain types of relationships based on this, and on the material culture that we find. So an example would be our stamped pottery that we see. Some people know that there's a direct line of change or a direct line of exchange because these wooden paddles sometimes would crack, and the crack is left in the pottery design almost like a fingerprint or thumbprint. And so you can either think of it as the paddle is being exchanged and moving from one town to another, or the pottery is being moved from one town to the other. And so you can see that there's links in that with trade from one direct point to another. But then you also have assimilation or enculturation, which is basically you start taking on the characteristics of basically the people that influence you. And here at Etowah, I've seen some documentations from some other archaeologists who think that when Etowah and some of the other major sites in the United States from the Mississippian time were created, they were almost like colonies of various tribes of Native Americans, different cultural groups that came together, and within a generation or two, you see them merge as one. So think of it as, I like to say, like going into a big city like New York, where you have different sections of people from different subcultures that are living. You'll have the Asian side of town where you have people set up with a lot of your Asian cuisine shops, and then you may have another section that has your Hispanic or your Latin. But then in other places, eventually you see it where they're no longer set in those one side of town or the other, but they're all mixed and intermingled, and people don't think of them as being outside of their culture, but as part of their own culture. So a good example of direct line of exchange is like when we have one of our flint knappers come to do a program, and they teach one or multiple people at the event to make an arrow point or some other object, and that person in turn would teach. They had somebody that taught them, so what they're teaching is what they have been taught. The student's arrowhead is going to be almost exactly like the teacher's. But then you also have that assimilation or enculturation through things like trade or conquest, and almost always you're going to notice that there's a two-way exchange. When somebody comes in, you're trading something. So in the past, when you were trading, you weren't trading for money, but you were trading for objects. So one person's basket against another person's pottery, they take those back home. Somebody may like it, and so they're going to try to basically copycat and make it. And so with food is a big one. When food comes in, people, if they like it, they're going to try to basically get that recipe book and try to make it for their own. Conquest is one of those things where sometimes the assimilation and enculturation is forced on somebody. So somebody may come in and not like your food, your type of things, and basically force you to change what you're farming. Versus with trade, you may adopt those trade items and do it on your own. So Etowah has lots of connections across time, and I'm going to try to show some of these trade networks and historic pathways connecting Etowah, and like I said, through trade. And hopefully my maps are going to be visible enough for everybody to see when I get to them. So over here, I've got a 1992 map of Cartersville, and let's see if I can make my cursor way down here. If you look in the bottom, here's where Etowah is, and straight across over towards Ladd's Mountain, and Vaughn Mountain over here. Over here is where the leak site would have been, and over here, of course, at Ladd's Mountain is where the Shaw Mound. And if you're not familiar with Ladd's Mountain, it at one time had a large stone formation on top. So those sites are there, but in many cases they've been destroyed. If you look at the streets, you're going to see that they're pretty much the same as they are. There's been some changes, and if you've drove around town here in Cartersville, you know that there's roads being widened and straightened, and new stuff going on all the time. We can jump back into the 50s. This is 1955. This is right after the lake had been built. And here again, if you were to look, we're not going to see it too well on this map, I don't think, but Etowah is right down in this bottom corner, right smack in the middle, and you can see some of the things going on. I'm going to jump to the next because we're going to jump back. Right here, y'all probably can't see it, but this is the old courthouse. So that's the Bartow History Museum in 1885. By 1895, I think it had already been moved. And so on one of these other maps, I found these cool, they're insurance maps in this for the city of Cartersville. And it's interesting because we don't think about gasoline engines being in Cartersville, but on these maps for insurance, there's actually quite a few gasoline engines, probably powering some of those one cycle engines for ice factory, and there was a tannery and some other things. And then we can jump back in time. So we're going to try to go back real quick. Between 1834 and 1822, we know that the Trail of Tears occurred. So we're talking Cherokee territory at the moment because this would have been Cherokee territory at that time. And my cursor here, if you can see it, there is the little town of Hughes. That's where Sally Hughes's ferry crossed, where Highway 293 was. And upstream, you'll see the little town of Etowah. It's not going to be too visible. But then over here on the other map, you can see the Chattahoochee River here at this one point, it's supposed to go due west. It doesn't go exactly due west, but that is the boundary between the lower creeks and the Cherokee. And the line follows the Chattahoochee River. And by this time, the state of Georgia is over here. It had started to move in, and you can see different things. So Trail of Tears, if you want to see some of the forts and where they were at, there was one over near the Bartow-Floyd County line along the river, and I believe it's Cedar Creek. I want to say it's Fort Beam. I can't remember the exact name. I had this link pulled up, and of course they're not working. So there are quite a few forts for the removal of the Cherokee. They were rounded up. They were put in these forts. And in 1828, 1838, 10 years almost to the date after gold was found in them there hills. So gold was found as far south as, I believe, Paulding County, but it was found up in the mountains. And by 1830 on the census, we see that lots of white intruders are in the area. And way back in that Treaty of Hopewell between the state of Georgia and the Cherokee, it basically said that the Cherokee were free to deal with intruders how they felt. By the time you get to the 1830s, the state of Georgia seems to have other ideas, and so we see a lot of bad things happening. And this, of course, in 1815, this is basically the Creek War. During the War of 1812, a lot of people try to separate out the Creek War. It's been historically done. Basically, the Creek War was between the Creek and the Cherokee. The Creek and the Cherokee were on different sides. So the Cherokee had sided with the Americans, and some of the Creek, not all of them, had sided with basically the British. And so that caused a little bit of a civil war between the Creek and the Cherokee. The War 1812 seems to have lasted a little bit longer. And of course, most people don't realize that Creek and Cherokee soldiers were with, basically they helped defeat the Battle of New Orleans with our future president there, Andrew Jackson. Going back a little further in time, this is before the Louisiana land purchase. I have a really good map in a book that I own, and you can see the entire United States here, and there's a huge empty space basically here from Georgia all the way through the Louisiana Purchase, all the way to the West Coast, all the way up to Alaska. But if you do look, there are things known about it. So there are explorers that were in these territories before Lewis and Clark. Some of them were French, some of them were Spanish, even, they were mapping. So when Napoleon decided to sell Louisiana to the United States, it was not completely unknown territory like sometimes we are taught that it was. Actually, Lewis and Clark ran to a French man that I remember his name, that in several occasions they got Osage orange samples from him. They didn't make it back to Washington, D.C. the first time, so it became U.S. territory. They got more samples, and the Osage orange, or the hedge apple, was spread towards the east. So here again, this is a blow up of another map in that book that I have from 1797. If you will notice, the state of Georgia goes all the way to the Mississippi River. It's called the Georgia Western Territory. So not very long after this, like a year or two, it becomes especially the lower part becomes the Mississippi Territory, and then the state of Georgia gets redefined. But what I want to point out is it's not completely accurate. Let me go back up, hit the wrong button there. You'll notice that the Chattahoochee River is almost exactly straight up and down, and it curves not a whole lot, but it ends up meeting the headwaters of the Savannah River. So we know that the Savannah River and the Chattahoochee do not come from the same spring source. And we also, if we go the middle of Florida there where Mobile Bay is, right there where it says West Florida, and it goes right up through the middle, that would be the Mobile Bay coming up and eventually becoming the Etowah River there. And you can see there's lots of little dots where there are mounds. So if you were to blow up this map, you actually, it has where all the different mound sites are, not necessarily named, but it lists the number of people living in that territory. So this area would have still been technically Cherokee. However, if you go back just a few years to that 1755, the Creeks and the Cherokees living in this area around the Etowah Mounds, played that ball game. And we know that from a treaty also that's mentioned. So let's jump back to another time frame, 1760. We again see that the Cherokee are sided with the British, in this case during the French and Indian Wars, and the Creek sided with the Spanish, who were allied with the Spanish and French. So what we see here is we've got the Chattahoochee River is that lowest river in the center of the bottom page, and then you see the Savannah River way over there coming out of the bottom corner. And then you've got what is probably, it says a branch of the Mississippi, and this most likely is the Tennessee River. And then the other one may be the Ohio. But they're not exact maps. They're basically maps to give general ideas of where to go to. So sometimes people may think that they were on the Chattahoochee and they may have been on the Etowah, or vice versa. And if you were getting on some of these other branches, the same thing. So our territory was really not known very well. But go back a little further, and on this map, you'll notice that the state of Georgia actually, at one point in time, was part of, in this case, the colony of Carolina before North and South Carolina separated. And if you look really closely, you'll actually see some of the old roads. So if you look there where it says the Gulf of Mexico, you've got two rivers coming up, and that main one coming up, you'll see is the Chattahoochee, and it basically goes to where it says the Appalachian Mountains. And then that where that split is probably the split for the Flint River, which goes more towards where it says Azela in South Carolina. But stretching across there, you see some roads that are drawn in, and there, if you follow the one right there where it says south, where the H is, you'll notice that there's a little island in the middle of the Savannah River, and that is pretty much where Augusta is. So that is the basically Highway 20 or Interstate 20 going across through where Atlanta is, which if you get over there far enough, you'll see a Native American tribe listed as the Chattahoochees, which would probably be also could be a mistaking part of the Chattahoochee River. And then, of course, before Etowah, we have travelers hunting for resources. So I've got this map here, and just kind of look at where my cursor is. Over here in California, we have tar, and it made its way all the way over. And if you look, there's rivers, and my cursor's disappeared for a second, all the way over here to Etowah, where my cursor is now. And so if you look at the main rivers, you can kind of get an idea of how it may have gotten here. People a lot of times went downstream in canoes, and then they would have walked upstream when they traded. And that's just simply because it's a little difficult to paddle a big wooden canoe upstream sometimes. Of course, if you have enough paddlers in the canoe, that would be not as hard. So with that idea of water, people are traveling around these waterways, streams, and springs to look for food and shelter. So we know here in Etowah that there was megafauna. We know that there was mastodons and other large animals like that, the peccaries. We sometimes find them in the caves and overhangs that are found in this area. So there's caves up near Adairsville. There's caves. Ladd's Mountain had a cave in it that had, megafauna remains. Some in Adairsville, some over towards Rome. They're scattered everywhere. But people living in this area were traveling back and forth hunting this megafauna. And we know that because of some of the large stone points found in our area. But we also know that they were hunting smaller stuff. So in almost all of these Mississippian sites, you're going to find things like turtle shells and fish bones coming out of the streams. And then in a lot of places around these springs, you're going to find where people were sitting and chipping away at chert and other things to make their points. So eventually people start settling down, and some of the earliest settlements we're going to see are places like over here at the Leak site where people are building mounds. And that's from basically the woodland time frame. Before that, people are still seem to be moving around. So some of the first farming that we see are going to be things like sunflowers and gourds, and eventually corns, beans, and squash and other things come in. And so there's a difference between farming and cultivating. And I always like to mention that because you can farm oak trees. People used to eat acorns. You can plant oak trees in long lines if you wanted to, and they're going to produce acorns for you, but it takes so long, you may not necessarily be able to cultivate that oak tree versus something more modern like a fruit tree, apple trees and stuff. And when I say more modern being brought into this area, you can cross pollinate and get different apples. And within 4, 5, 7 years, you're gonna know whether or not you like that new apple. So same way with corn and beans. Native Americans were cultivating and making new varieties of corn and new varieties of beans. And so a lot of what we eat today is actually based on some of that stuff that was being done in the 15, 16, 1700s. Now, here at Etowah, our site is built along the Etowah River, and here we've got a picture of the Pumpkin Vine Creek coming into the Etowah. You can see a little bit of fish trap. I like to call it a fish trap. Most everybody does. It's actually a fish weir. The trap is what you put in it. So here at our museum, we have a big fish basket. People still in South America use this same fish basket. It's a design that we see. Matter of fact, if you were to go to I don't know if one of the hunting fishing supplies, you can buy a miniature version to put your crickets in. It's basically a cone trap that you put stuff in, and it's difficult for them to come out of. You have an opening that you basically squeeze them out of. So you would put one of those fish baskets in the river, or maybe a long string with fish hooks. We know that they were using fish hooks. We've got several of those here at the Mounds, some made of bone, some made of copper. Probably use them more like a trot line, which happens to be illegal to use now, but in the past would have been something that they would have used. So you put bait on it and fish come, they eat it, and you catch lots of fish. And then you use the parts of the fish you don't eat to help grow the crops that I just mentioned. Fish inside of the garden help create better fertilizer, better nutrients. So here's a pun, a joke. Whose fault is it? We live on the Knoxville, Cartersville fault here. That water coming out of the mountain pass up here where the dam is in the past would have flooded this area, and all of that alluvial soil would have fertilized everything. That's one of the reasons why Etowah is where it's at. The other reason is along with this fault line, we have bukus of different minerals in the area. And those things in the past, the cherts and the limestones and the sandstones that we see in our area make really good materials to build stuff with, as does the copper and the iron ore. So quartz, flint, chert, all those hard rocks are knappable. I can hit them, I can break them, I can shape them into what I want that's hard and sharp. Certain things like slate and sandstone, and I don't know if soapstone directly in our area, but there is a place down towards Atlanta called Soapstone Ridge that Native Americans traded for. We have a huge bowl here at the museum that was found just over at another side across the river. It would have been part of the Etowah town in the past, but archaeologically it's a different site. These types of stone are worked by sanding and polishing them. So a lot of the polished kilt axes and the grinding bowls and things, that's what I'm talking about. They're made of those types of rocks. And then of course we've got things like graphite, ochre, mica from a lot further up the river, you know, up say Cherokee County and a little further. But clays, these things are shapeable and you can use them to decorate with. You can use them as paints and glazes. Clay was one of those very popular materials in this area. There was actually the famous clay pits over near where Stamp Creek empties into the Etowah River. It was used for a very long time. It was used in historical time all the way back. It's almost a perfect clay that you don't have to mix with other clays. However, we do look back, and one of the things that we see with the Mississippian culture is they used aggregate in their clay that is basically made from seashells. So we see these seashells being brought in to mix during the historic time, woodland time, after we see the Mississippian moving into the historical. You're going to see sand and gravel grit being mixed in. So if you want a free book from a long time ago, you can go to this website. I'll give you a second to look at it, but it's basically a report on all the minerals that we see in our area. And so this is a good thing that the Native Americans would have known where a lot of this stuff was. They wouldn't have necessarily used the same names, but they were using those resources if they knew how to use it. So copper is not necessarily from around here. There's some small deposits, I think, in Pickens County, more so up in Tennessee. And you go way up near the Great Lakes and you're getting what we would refer to as native copper, almost like gold nuggets, but it's copper. And they were hammering it down. The Native Americans had not learned in the Mississippian culture to smelt it. So they were just getting it hot, quenching it in water, hammering it into shape. And as you hammer it, copper gets harder. It's the opposite of iron ore. So some of the other things they were using, ochre, I do believe, is still mined today. It's in the past was used, mixed with buttermilk and used as paint on red barns. The Native Americans used it to glaze pottery, so they mixed it with things. They also mixed it with things like bear liver oil to paint their bodies red, partly usually during warfare, but other ceremonial things. And graphite can be done the same way. Graphite can be mixed and painted in a dark color, black, and the red color. There are also colors in the Native American medicine wheel. So we also have kaolin in the area up towards Cassville. This could be mixed with indigo to make blue, and or left white. Ochre also, I believe, comes in lighter shade, almost yellow. So you get a lot of these things that are when they're no longer just useful for material things, sometimes they're useful for other things. So this ochre and this graphite are on ceremonial palettes here in the museum, and basically they're showing that they were used for ceremonial purposes. Ochre and some white material, possibly kaolin, was used in ceramic glazes to denote war and peace. Devices that were used for ceremonies devoted to burials and death. So we see lots of different things there with that. And that's pretty much all I've got.